Buongiorno, grazie per la vostra partecipazione a questo incontro, la Cina tra scienza, tecnologia e storia, che è curato dal China Center del nostro Ateneo. Io sono Michele Bonino, insegno architettura qui al Politecnico e in questi anni sono delegato del rettore per i rapporti con i paesi asiatici. Come sapete l'incontro sarà in inglese, i nostri ospiti sono in Cina, si sono trovati tutti a Pechino, ci collegheremo, siamo già collegati con loro, quindi passo in inglese e fra breve li introdurrò. So, very warm thank to our guest, also for the effort to gather all together at the Tsinghua University. You are there in Beijing, good evening, and today we are going to discuss with them. Before introducing our respected guest, I would like to say just a few words about the China Center of Politecnico di Torino that was born 4 years ago when our university realized about, for instance, the big community of Chinese students that are around 1,000 at the present moment. We have also a very big community of alumni, so the former students, so already 2,500 graduated at Politecnico di Torino, and during the year an increasing relation with Chinese universities and other partners like institutions, industries, companies, and so on. So we decided to create a center that is not just about managing this relation, but is about trying to create more familiarity with the Chinese context, to be closer to this big country that is almost a continent and with a very different culture, as we will see today together with our guest. So every Biennale Tecnologia, I remember also the 2 former editions, we are trying to organize meetings like this as discussion to create, to strengthen the bridge between our country and China. So in this spirit, I remember exactly 1 year ago was born this event when Alberto Bardi, still in Italy at that time, just before leaving to China as a professor in the Tsinghua University, visited us. We met for first time, and then in the following weeks, we imagined an event in this Biennale dedicated to see the history of science and technology in China, trying to get a different perspective that is not from the West, that is not Eurocentric, but is trying to see also the insight from China and be mutual in the interpretation of the very interesting phenomena that we are going to discuss today. So I will leave the floor to our guest. After their speeches, their discussion, some 10 to 15 minutes will be available for discussion, so please take the floor for questions or comments. And it's my pleasure to introduce our respected guest, Professor Sun Xiaochun, professor at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He was the president of the Commission of History of Astronomy of an International Astronomical Union, and is the president of the Chinese Society for the History of Science and Technology. Welcome to our Biennale. To his left, to his right, John Alekna, professor of the Peking University in Beijing in the Department of History of Sciences, Technology, and Medicine, and former student former scholar at Princeton University in the US. And to our right, the already mentioned Alberto Bardi, professor at Tsinghua University, where he's teaching both history of science and technology, but also classical languages, including Greek, Antique Greek to Chinese students. I will have a question for you later in the discussion. So the floor is yours, Alberto, for the moderation. We are very happy because the 3 universities I mentioned, the 3 institutions our guests belong, are the 3 more relevant academic and scientific institutions in China. So we are very honored to have you together with us. Thank you, Alberto. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michele, for your kind introduction. And so it's my pleasure to speak from Beijing and have my guests tonight. But as an Italian scholar, I'm particularly happy because, of course, I'm addressing an audience in my native country. I did my undergrad in Turin, and talking about China, my memory goes immediately to famous figures like Marco Polo, who likely was the first link between Italy and China. And to talk about science, technology, and history in general in China is to involve the complexity of communication and history uh, concerning China. So, John, you have been researching on broadcasting, technopolitics in China in the 20th century. That's one of your main research area. So could you tell us more about how we should approach technology, science in history? For example, I remember you mentioned me that to describe science and technology in Chinese, there is a two characters phrase, right?
Yes. Oh, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to begin this conversation with both of you today and with the audience in Torino. Thank you to the Biennale for hosting this, and thank you to Tsinghua for giving us the space to have this conversation. I absolutely do believe that it's most important to begin with the active definition, right? And as you mentioned, yes, in Chinese there is a two-character phrase which is called 科技, which means both science and technology, or some sort of techno-science. It fuses two separate realms of thought in many Western minds, right? The idea that technology and science might be separate, but in common usage here, they are a single phrase. To what extent is this a significant fact? It may not sound incredibly significant, but there is a larger point behind this. It shows that China has its own historically informed ways of thinking about the problems of science and technology. Much of that was translated, of course, from the Western tradition, but much of it is also informed by China's experience and encounter with 19th century imperialism, with relations with 20th century Japan, both peaceful and warlike. Uh, Additionally, the relationship that has evolved with the Soviet Union after 1949. All of these things played an incredibly important role in the evolution of the ideas of science and technology in China. And even the word itself, 科学, which is how science is usually translated, is a derivative or was adopted from a Japanese terminology at the very end of the 19th century. So what is the point? All of this kind of guides us to a larger conclusion, which is that looking at the ways in which language and ideas are organized in a different culture, like China, for instance, the ways in which contingent histories can inform thinking begin to destabilize an idea that some people might have of an eternal, objective, or fixed science. The idea that there is only one way in which politics, technology, and society can interact with one another. And as you mentioned in your brief introduction, my own research points to this conclusion that, in fact, the ways in which technology, politics, and society interact can be radically different in different cultures and in different historical experiences. And my own research is about communications technologies, as you mentioned, especially radio. And one of the interesting findings I have had is that mass communication in China, as defined by the act of most people being able to receive regular news and information, starts much later than in Europe. And fundamentally, this is because of poor communications and transportation infrastructure, limiting the development of newspapers. And this is essentially and fundamentally a different story than the growth of mass media and mass politics in Europe, where in the 19th century, an explosion of cheap mass media created the bourgeois national revolutions that unified and consolidated nation states into coherent political bodies. But this story of 19th century newspapers and the creation of the nation state doesn't have to be that way. That is a very contingent European story, which the Chinese experience contradicts. So in fact, there are many ways of making and remaking societies. So when we begin to look at science, technology, and its vocabularies, its experiences in a place outside of our own traditions, our own cultures, we can begin to see that things which formerly seemed very solid are in fact changeable, that they change over time, they are historic, they are contingent, and they are constructed. And I think that is the most important value that we can derive from the study of science and technology in China.
Thank you, John. I think that's very useful to give us the coordinates, at least intellectual coordinates, to go on with our conversation. Of course, this is a very general picture, but of course we have a limited time here. And so, given this broad intellectual picture, let's try to start with one particular field, that is the history of astronomy. Because Xiaochun, this is one of your research area in the history of astronomy, as it was one of the first fields in which Chinese and Western scholars interacted. For example, I'm thinking about another Italian figure, Matteo Ricci,
Yes.
so later than Marco Polo. And astronomy, both in the Western world and in China, sees the most developments towards a mathematized science, for example. But although the mathematization is present in both worlds, in astronomy, the outcomes are different. So could you tell us more about this field?
Yes, sure. Yeah. In the first place, I would like to thank organizers and Albert for inviting me to be in this event. If we not for the COVID-19 situation, I would very much like to go to Turin, to talk with the audience. I think, yeah, you mentioned that one of the most important aspects of science and also actually technology in ancient China, that's astronomy. Yeah. John just talked about the communication. Yes, actually in China, astronomy also had that kind of function of communication between heaven and man.
Right.
Astronomers acted like as a kind of mediator between the heavenly way and the human way. Yeah, how the sun and the moon and the planet moves. That's the rules of natural rules, but also in human morality, in human actions, we also should follow the way of heaven.
Yes.
So that's exactly what astronomy was so important in China. So that's one thing is, of course, is to make calendar. So you do which things at which time.
Right.
It's especially important for agrarian society, because farmers had to know, when to sow, when to harvest. So that's important. And also for the ruler, for the emperors, it's also so because this calendar, the following the seasons, it's a way, it's legitimized its rule. It looks like if you have a good calendar, you somehow receive the mandate of heaven. So you have the authority to run the people, to run the empire. So that's why I think astronomy was particularly important as a branch of science in ancient China. And of course, when you do astronomy, you need observation. You observe the celestial phenomena, the sun and the moon and the 5 planets, conjunctions, eclipses. And in China, also all kinds of phenomena, such as comets, meteors, or eclipses, or comets. Or supernova. nova. We call the
Nova.
Chinese called a guest star, because you see no star in that area, but suddenly when star appeared, and then say this is a guest coming, and after a few
That's
days
interesting.
it went away. So we call it a guest star. So it's the Chinese people, made meticulous observations of the celestial phenomena in order to following the ways, because they think celestial phenomena also constitute a kind of omen, sign for whether the society is ruled well or not. So that's the importance of observation of the celestial phenomena. Of course, when you do want to make the calendar, you want to should have, as Albert just mentioned, you had a mathematical astronomy.
Yeah.
You should have to do measurement, and you do measurement. You need an instrument, make an instrument. So we have, for example, the glomer. It's a vertical stick. You just measure the the shadow of the stick at the noon, and then it changes over seasons. So that's the way you can use the glomer to determine which season of the year. And of course, you also have a lot of we call armillary spheres that are composed of a lot of rings: horizontal, horizon, circle, ring, and meridians, equator, ecliptic. Right. So instrument itself is a kind of a cosmology, because it imitates the ways how the celestial bodies moves. So in this sense, you just condense that big universe, big cosmos, to that small instrument, and then using sighting tube to make alignment between the smaller one and the bigger one, and then you do the measurement. So that's astronomical measurement. So that's, I think, in China, in this kind of instrument technologies was quite well advanced. Yeah, even when it comes to the, for example, for the I think it's 11th century or early 12th century, the Chinese already made a very, very huge, automatic observatory. So that means with armillary spheres, with tracking the stars automatically, right. Use the clock tower. Yeah. So the central wheel was driven by the water flow from the clepsydra, from the water clock, and then it's powered by the water, and then it turns around once every 24 hours, something. In this way, you can guide not a telescope, the armillary sphere to follow the stars, and also you can demonstrate the movement of the celestial bodies with the celestial globe, and also you can tell time, like big bang, clock tower. Yeah. So that's clock tower. I think so. Before the telescope, when we mention telescope, of course, it's also Italian, Galileo, who made those very important telescope inventions. Before telescope, China already had very advanced technology in instrument making, astronomical instrument making, and when Chinese made a calendar, since it symbolizes the mandate of heaven, that means each new dynasty, when the new ruler comes to the position, come to throne, they want a new calendar, right? Because that symbolizes a new mandate. Right. So that's particular. For example, in about the 100 BC, the first century BC, we have the Emperor Wu Di, for example. He organized a great calendar reform. We call it great inception, the great grand beginning of everything. Calendar reform. Right. They made a calendar which was then served as an example to all calendars, mathematical systems afterwards. Right. So that's called a Tai Chu calendar. So in the following dynasties, each dynasty will have a new calendar. In some dynasties, for example, in the Song dynasty around 10th and 11th century, each new emperor, even in the same dynasty, when they come to the throne, they wanted a new calendar system. So you can see a lot of calendar reforms in Chinese history. And then, of course, when it comes to the end of the Ming dynasty, that's the beginning of the 17th century, end of the 16th century, they also had a calendar reform. Then there was a debate about which system we should use, because Jesu's missionary Matteo
the
Ricci
Jesuits,
mentioned
yes,
it.
of
You also
course.
mentioned that.
Yes.
Already brought European astronomy to China.
Yeah.
And then there was a debate which system we should use. And finally, Matteo Ricci, and not only Matteo Ricci, but also John Adam Schaffner Bear from Germany, convinced the emperor and also Xu Guangqi, the collaborator, to use the Western new method to reform the calendar. So that's for the calendar making, yeah. And one of the things, I want to say is about this astronomy is, of course, you have to calculate, compute, predict the movement of 5 planets. That's so in Greek. You study Armagist, and also in China the same. We have also kind of a mathematical astronomy. Just the approaches were a little bit different.
Yes.
Yeah, the Greeks use.
That's important.
The Greeks use, geometrical model.
Yeah.
They use circles, epicycles, difference. So these, so circles and on the circles. So in this way to approach the real motion. But the Chinese had a very different way. They use algebraic, arithmetical model.
Algebraic.
It looks like the movement of the planet is like using a kind of a piecemeal function.
Right.
Yeah. So at how long it moves at how much speed, and when it comes to a standstill, when retrograde motion, and then move forward again, and so in this way to explain the planetary motions. It's remarkable that the Chinese in this way also reach the same level in terms of precision, already as that of the 16th century Europe in the 11th century China.
Yes.
So they use numerical method, but not the geometrical approach. Yeah, I think that's the difference. And one last point about astronomy, I think, is that there has been always communications, exchanges between East and the West. Long before Marco Polo, maybe 4th century before that, already we have influences from India, for example, with the arrival of Buddhists there. Of course, India was in turn influenced by the Greeks. And in the 13th century, the Genghis Khan, the Mongol rule, you have astronomers come from Islamic world, the broader astronomical instrument. And also the Chinese has also some influence on the West, actually. For example, the Guo Shoujing, that's the beginning, that's the 13th century, end of the 13th century. His instrument, he simplified those armorial spheres because there are too many rings. If you have too many rings, you block the area which you want to observe. So he made the structure more like nowadays we use for telescope. It's called equatorial mounting. So you you do not have those rings anymore, but with a telescope directly pointed to anywhere you would like. So that's exactly the Chinese way of we call it equatorial mounting of the instrument.
And that spreads to Europe?
Not Europe. First Central Asia to Samarkand, to Ulubek, and then probably influenced Tycho Brahe. We don't know.
Tycho Brahe. Very interesting. That's cool.
I think so. Astronomy as a branch of science is symbolized. It's really, we can see the connections between our civilizations. It's so important.
It becomes very clear in the field in which you study that Eurasia really is difficult to understand as a series of separate civilizations. Rather, it's cultural centers, but which are constantly interacting with one another, which are never pure, which are never necessarily fully independent or traditional, right? The influence goes back thousands of years, really. I mean, we have to look at the very earliest instances of Buddhism arriving in China, right, in the 4th or 5th centuries, to look at the first documented, quote unquote, foreign influences, which is really fascinating and very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you a question.
Yes.
Okay, so I love that you were talking about astronomy as communication.
Yes.
And so I was thinking this is very, very interesting because it's almost like, yes, the heavens communicating with the government or the emperor, but also the emperor or the government communicating with the people.
Yes.
And so the calendar is a communications device through which we organize the people lower down, which I think is a very interesting idea that you're kind of pointing towards. And the fact that this is a common problem across different cultures. So in the 6th or 17th century, late 16th century, both European societies and in China are struggling with increasingly inaccurate calendars, which are causing problems not only between whatever the heavens and the elite, but the elite managing the people below. And so there's these common human problems having to do with mathematics and science, which everybody is trying to deal with at the same time. It's a kind of unified Eurasian problem, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
You're right. Yeah, not only the emperor, but even for individual like a farmer, he's a kind of a go-between. He should follow the seasons to do his agricultural work, to do his farming. So he's also a kind of a go-between between the heavenly ways and his maybe social function. As a farmer. Yeah.
And if we want to look at this from a political or sociological point of view, where else is the state entering everyday life, right? Maybe you get taxed once a year. Maybe if something terrible happens, you might interact with an official every few years. But the calendar is an everyday way in which the people interact with larger societal structures. So it's really kind of unique in an early modern and pre-modern period. A very interesting topic.
Yeah, so this is a very fascinating picture, and we are, of course, with our limited time, started to enucleating the cross-cultural approach to science. We are trying not to categorize something as properly Chinese or properly Western, as sometimes it has been done in the past. So with some Eurocentric tendencies in historiography. Notably, the eminent British historian of science, Joseph Needham, who wrote a monumental work about the history of science in China and is undoubtedly influential, posed a question which is renowned to specialists, but maybe not to the public. That is, why there was no scientific revolution in China. So given all the facets that you've been dealing so far, how would you reformulate this question? How would you rewrite the history of science in general?
Sure.
Between
so,
so how would you use this cross-cultural identity of the scientific problems to readdress this question?
Sure. Well, this is a very, very common question which gets rephrased in so many ways. Joseph Needham was a very prominent historian. He was also a diplomat. He served in the Second World War. He served in China during the war and collected a great number of scientific and historical works during that period, and later went back and began writing a comprehensive, many, many volumed history, encyclopedia really, of the history of science, technology, and medicine in China. And he formulated this question, which was quite notable for the time, which was, why did China not have a scientific revolution? And many people have tried to address this with cultural answers, with kind of materialist or structural answers. But I think the best way to tackle this is to take it apart logically first and say that to answer why something didn't happen is almost impossible if we think about it empirically or logically. You can't prove a negative. So we have to look at why something did happen, and that something is the scientific revolution in Europe. And this is the entire subject of the history of science, which I'm sure even many people in the audience are familiar with. The answer to the question of what happened in Europe in the 17th century that made it a center for this growing systematized knowledge. Well, it's very difficult to answer. Some people say things like the pragmatism might be one way in which the Chinese are kind of different, that the Europeans had more abstraction. And this is maybe, it has been pointed to an inheritance of the ancient Greek tradition, which you might be an expert on. But the recent history of science in China points towards the fact that we should turn this around and say that, in fact, European scientific revolution was extremely empirical, extremely pragmatic, extremely utilitarian as well. And so this Chinese focus on pragmatism, on use, on utility is not necessarily so different. And so wherein lies the difference? People have argued more recently that we need to look at a short divergence. So if we want to mention the name of Kenneth Pomerantz and The Great Divergence, obviously a very influential book. He argues that really it's only in the 19th century that we see a fundamental divergence. And I think even in your own research, we know that China is not very delayed in receiving the latest scientific knowledge and even adopting
absolutely.
it. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Even, for example, the Galileo's observations with telescope, the sunspot, the phases of Venus, or the crack, mountains on the moon, everything are just a matter of 15 years. Yeah. All this knowledge already transmitted to China. So, of course, it's aroused a great sensation in Europe. But the fact is, in China, it did not have such a huge effect.
Why?
That's a good question. That's because, I think that's the different cosmology. I mean, that's because according to Greeks and European tradition, everything in heaven is what above the moon is incorruptible, immutable. It can never change. So people do not. That if you with a telescope you find such changes, such corruptions in the sky, that's must be a big surprise, even shock to the European, mentality, to the intellectuals. But for Chinese, there is no such difference between what is in heaven and what is on the earth. The terrestrial physics and the heavenly physics are the same. They follow the same rules, yin and yang and the five phases.
Yes.
So that it didn't arouse such kind of disruption in the cosmological views, philosophical ideas. So I think that they can just accept it very naturally. Okay, that's normal. You can find such things in the sky, things we can see, all changes on the earth. Why not? So that kind of thing.
So I would one other point in answering this Needham question, which is that many historians recently studying the history of Western scientific and industrial revolutions have pointed to the mathematization of society, the growing movement of these high-level mathematical calculations, physical calculations, mechanical calculations into the artisanal and working classes of societies like England or the Low Countries or France in the 18th century. And that this is something which is fundamentally different from a place like China, where there might be a lower level of numeracy, in other words, facility with calculation, abstract calculation, that is, among an artisanal or kind of middle class. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that way. Because I don't. Because actually, mathematically, I mean, as I just mentioned, the Chinese has a mathematical models about the universe, very numerical, very high level actually. So when, for example, Einstein talk about the birth of modern science, two factors. One is the mathematics and the logic, which from Greek, and then you have experiment, the Galileo way, Galilean way of doing things, experiment. I think both these things are not necessarily, not really lacking in Chinese, in ancient China.
Yes.
Yeah. They actually, for example, the numerical things, as I said, the way the compose kind of hypothesis, numerical hypothesis, and then use it to predict the eclipses, the conjunctions of planets, everything you name it, all of the celestial planetary phenomena. And we very precise, actually, as I just mentioned, they're far ahead of Europeans in the 11th century. In 11th century. So it's only after Kepler, after Newtonian, then, of course, Europe moved far ahead in terms of mathematical astronomy. So I wouldn't say in ancient China, mathematically, it's a kind of a low level. I mean,
that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know. It's actually, it's just to have a very different approach.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the kind of the point I think I was trying to make is that at a high level, we may have a similar level of mathematical ability up to a very late period, but that the mathematical training in things like Newtonian calculus has moved into the artisanal and working classes that become low-level engineers by the end of the 18th century in a place like England, whereas that doesn't occur really anywhere else, even within Europe, right? And so this is something that people say might be something that is one fundamental difference between certain small countries in Western Europe and everywhere else. It's not about the highest levels, it's about the middle classes having numeracy at a late period.
This way of mechanistic way of thinking.
Yes.
Things,
it has penetrated
into all spheres of the society.
Yeah. Very interesting question.
Yeah. So with these interactions between different levels of the society, may we say very generally that science is a kind of connecting force? And if it is this kind of force or element which is a link, which acts as something unifying, can we use it to connect cultures in some way? So we can see historical figures like Matteo Ricci with this perspective, or how should we explore such episodes of connections between China and the West?
Definitely, it is. I think it's you put it very well. It's a science is a connecting force between civilization, because all the way to the ancient times, we have already connections, exchanges between China and Roman Empire, for example, the Han Dynasty, they have the Silk Road stuff, and we have coins from Roman Empire and so that's connection. And of course, and then later in the medieval, in the I just mentioned Islamic culture also come to China, and the Chinese calendars and instrument also going all the way to Europe. And I think modern science, without this mingling of civilizations, of cultures from the Greek tradition, maybe Babylonian tradition, and also India, Middle East, and the Chinese, that's occasioned at the beginning, the occurrence of the modern science. So modern science is, of course, originated in Europe, but it's not necessarily a European thing. It's world science. Absolutely. So all civilizations, all cultures can contribute to that science, and all recognize its importance, because that's the thing which no ideology, everybody understood it. So I think it should be a kind of a connecting force between civilizations.
I totally agree. And since science belongs to no single civilization by itself, as you said, not simply European, but it evolved globally, it can only be understood within this global context. And given that global context, it has to be something that unites people, that unites societies and civilizations, a connecting force between countries and people. And since it is a practice as much as a theory, that practice will always invite and encourage collaboration between different groups.
Yeah, that's one point that come to me. Yeah, I think even in the 17th and 18th century, when Western science was transmitted to China, the Chinese were not just passive acceptors.
Right.
Yeah, they're actively actually involved in modern science. One thing, when the French, sent a lot of mathematicians to China to help the Emperor Kangxi to survey the land, to make the geodesic surveys. So actually they measure the meridian. And then in Europe, you have a big controversy about, for example, the shape of the Earth, whether it's an oblong or whether it's it's a kind of an it's built at the equator or built at the poles. So you have a Cassini from the Paris Observatory debating, with the Newtonian tradition. So because Newton says it spins, of course, it's built at the equator. Right. But the pendulum measurement by the Cassini, by the French people, that did say, well, it's the other way around. So the Chinese measurement actually provided data for determining the shape of the Earth. So it's a part of the controversy of the modern science. Yeah, I think so. In this way, I think while accepting Western modern scientific knowledge from West, China was actually already in a way involved in the development of modern science. So that's
fascinating. Well, this is a very we want to end on a very positive note, right? Which is that science can always connect people. But we should also remember, I think, that science, as it's been understood by philosophers of science technology in the last, 50 years, is of, a society, a culture. Science is a practice among people. It is not separable from society. And for that reason, it is neither good nor bad. Right? So science, yes, can be used to connect people, but it's still going to be, unfortunately, a place where there is contest, where there is struggle, right? A site of contestation this is always going to be true. And it's our job to understand that because science changes, because its structure and its meaning is only what we give it, that we need to choose to give it a better meaning, a connected meaning, rather than a separate meaning.
Yeah.
And so I want to leave everybody with this thought that we get to decide what science and technology means for our societies, both domestically and internationally. And that is empowering, right?
Yeah, I fully agree with you this positive notion. Yeah, for thousands of years, civilizations were connected. Yeah, and the science and the technology played a very important role in that connection. And why nowadays we should talk about, for example, decoupling? It's always connected. You cannot decouple it because we should think about how to make better connections through our science, technology, and of course also culture, humanities. All these things are all connected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, if I may, we should use this positive approach to expect something promising in the future of science and technology in China, for example.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
So
we should think about these lines on what to expect in the so-called progress of science and technology.
Yes. Well, I mean, I would argue that science is not the same as progress, right? Progress is a narrative which we impose on a largely a very amorphous set of events, right?
Yeah.
And science and technology itself has no moral valence, essentially no moral valence within it. We only apply these moral valences to it, right?
Yeah.
And so whether we are going to have progress or not, as most people understand it, is a decision which society makes, right? This is my own perspective. So Can I predict the future? No.
Of course.
Is it my job as a person who is trying to be upright and moral to try to push for a better future? Then yes, I think that we can strive to have this kind of progress that people used to believe in.
Yeah, I think about the future science, we should really rethink about this notion of, for example, progress or mechanical view of the nature. Yeah, after all, we are living in the nature. The Chinese way always emphasize the harmonious existence between nature and the human beings. So it's this holistic approach, this organic unity of man and heaven. I should be considered in the development of future science, because mechanistic we are very successful for 300 years. To prove we have this modernity, this progress, everything is related somehow to this mechanistic view. But after all this, we also see problems. Yeah, right. Because whether it's sustainable, for example, whether it's really good for the happiness of the humankind.
Yeah.
So I think that probably while we are doing science, we can think about some ancient Chinese wisdom to think about the harmony between nature and man.
Yes,
I think that's for my thought on future science. Yeah.
Thank you, Xiaochun. Thank you, John. Unfortunately, our time is up. So I would like just to sum up following the tone of the organic unity. So in our with our chance to have this dialogue between us, we have reached an organic unity.
Yes.
And we have and well, we have been extending something that it was already begun in the past with Marco Polo and Matteo Ricci. So now I would like to conclude and leave the floor to the question of an Italian audience. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you.
Very take questions if you
fascinating
have any.
discussion. I hope we can continue now. We have some time. So while I invite, okay, I see already one question. Arriva. Possono essere fatte anche in italiano grazie all'interprete, che anzi approfitto per ringraziare. Se qualcuno preferisce in italiano va anche bene.
Okay, thank you for this insightful section. Congratulations for your presentation. You'll give many examples about cooperation in ancient times, in 18th centuries, and so on. Very, very interesting examples. But today we have many examples in the other way. It's not exactly cooperation, but some kind of protection or asymmetrical development. I'd like to give you two examples to make my question a bit more clear. About protection, a couple of months ago, years ago, there is a big problem with TikTok in the United States. They block TikTok for national security reasons, but I guess it's because of market reasons, and sometimes protection is because of political reasons, and it block the cooperation in the way that you show us in other moments. And today we have also some kind of locking technology. Some areas in the world that are very developing, very technology development, and others not so very developing. And it makes cooperation hard because there's great asymmetry between countries or between companies. So I would like to listen about the trade-off between cooperation and domination, and how what China position in this new international scenario. Thank you.
For me, yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I cannot say anything about the Chinese policy, but as a scholar, I studied in Europe and I also studied in the United States. I have been in Amsterdam and have been to Rome and Florence and Venice. So I think for me, science and tech, we should, of course, we should cooperate. We should have mutual exchanges because that's the way, that's good for our humanity. Mm-hmm. But sometimes for short terms, because of geopolitical reasons or ideological reasons, such things happens, when where you have this competitive, sometimes in a conflict between nation. But I think that's only short term, because for the long run, we have been humanity has been here already 5,000, even more than that. We have connections. For example, the wheat, Chinese, one of the agricultural product, the wheat was transmitted to China 5,000 years ago from Middle East, Middle East, and now it grows very well in China. Now also other technologies, and of course Chinese inventions such as Francis Bacon already mentioned this, gunpowder, printing and stuff, which really contributed a lot for the formation of the modern European civilization. I think if in the long run, we should really, as scholars, as students, of history of science, I would certainly say we should contribute to bring people together, to make the civilizations connected, not necessarily globalization. Of course, we have divisions of labor among civilizations, but absolutely we should keep connected. That's so cooperation for the future, not fighting for the future.
I would echo those statements. I think that we can have these normative beliefs that we need to prefer cooperation, while also being not naive and understanding that as historians, these kinds of non-cooperative or competitive situations have always existed within the realms of science and technology. If we want to think about how science and technology was developed in let's say 16th century Italy, for instance, we know that warfare was probably the most important reason that states would fund chairs of mathematics, because they would be able to calculate things like the artillery barrages, which they were constantly engaged in. Galileo's telescope was first used not to look at the moon or the stars, but to spot enemy warships approaching the harbor of Venice. So these kinds of things have always happened. I don't know whether that means we shouldn't worry about it. I think we should, but I think that worrying about it at the level of science and technology perhaps is not as useful as worrying about it at the level of politics. Science and politics are part of a similar spectrum, right? And perhaps focusing on one rather than the other might be the more useful path.
Thank you. While I invite them, maybe I just do one question to Alberto, since as the moderator didn't receive any question, and then the floor to the public for one last question before the end. So as I announced, I'm very interested in what you are teaching in Tsinghua. This is a little bit out of topic because we are going to talk about antique Greek, but not that much since you discussed a lot about science and knowledge as a very powerful vector of communication and exchange between different civilizations. So how is it going teaching Greek in one of the most important universities in the world as is Tsinghua to Chinese students? I was very impressed by this decision of your university to teach antique Greek, while in Italy, as we know, we have some people arguing that is not helpful anymore, for instance, in the high school to study ancient Greek. How is your experience in China?
It's a very challenging experience because, to put it simply, the Chinese language is based on syntax and the Greek language is based on morphology. So I'm spending a lot of time to get to the students the habit to reason according the lines of morphology in a language. But on the general level, the Tsinghua University, as also the other academic institutions in China, are interested in knowing more about European civilization. Therefore, they know that Greek is the basic language for the scientific and philosophical developments of our civilization. So that's why some people are interested in learning the language to be able to study the sources of these developments. That's the reason why I can teach Greek here.
Thank you,
Yes,
Alberto.
people are interested in Greek science. For example, today, just before this meeting, I went to Alberto's office. I see Armagest, on his desk. So I study astronomy too. So I'm very interested in the Greek way, doing astronomy, and of course have comparisons between Chinese way and the Greek way of doing astronomy.
Yeah, the Almagest, as some of you may know, is the major work of ancient astronomy and was written in Greek. So I'm giving a seminar on that work, apart from teaching properly ancient Greek.
Thank you. One more question from the public, Marco Begani, that is also part of the China Center.
Thank you very much for this very fascinating conversation. I have a question about the role of the universities in this dialogue. You have highlighted how much science is a place of connection between civilizations and countries and different cultures. Of course, this place is also very much influenced by political power and national interests. I mean, just if we have to conduct research on physical properties of semiconductors, that's a very critical sector of research today, for example. And while the way that the people are interested in the other cultures is extraordinary, Alberto just offered an example of how much Chinese students are interested in ancient Greek. This is extraordinary. So what is the role of the universities? Because the universities are in a very delicate and difficult place sometimes between this place of connection and the political influence. And we have very different experience, possibly, between Europe and China. I would like to have an idea from you about this difference and about the role itself of the universities should play. Thank you very much.
Sure, you go for it. Yeah, you study modern times.
Well, the universities here have always played a very important role as a connecting force. And of course, there are limitations which are structural, which have to do with the ways in which society as a whole are organized. I think this is true around the world. And yes, there are particularities that exist here in China today and have always existed. But I would hesitate to say that it's any more different than the mean, that's different from the mean of any place, right? So US universities are very different from Italian universities, which are very different from Chinese universities. I think they still play a very similar role within society and a similar role as a kind of node of connection. I think that's about as far as I can answer that question.
Yeah,
well, maybe
just
a simple. I can add something. The disciplines like history of science, philosophy of science, are focusing not just on discovering the evolution or how a particular field of science was improved. The essential is to focus on the elements of debate. So how the discoveries were made out of discussions and also struggles. Sometimes there is opposition, there is a non-cooperation between two parts. But out of that, in the university, as an institution, there can rise a solution due to the nature of the debate that science can propose, either to the professor and the students, to a research group with another group. And of course, the struggles is part of also the human nature, as the Greeks are teaching us, for example. But of course, I don't want to be naive, and that's enough.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would. Yeah, maybe I just. I think it's difficult question for me because, of course, you see tensions between politics and the science, and in China too. But now the trend, I think, in China, I mean, university, it's become very international. At least you have foreign professors and also students from other countries coming to China. So I think if there's any tension or conflict or controversy, I mean, it's not should be not about the science. It's all about the politics, you know, this ideological thing. I think these should, as scholars, as historians of science, we should really, we can think about this, but we should advocate, you know, we shouldn't really not really bothered by that kind of politics. We should really work for a common future, for our common goal. Yeah, we civilization, because that's the in the long run will be right. Yeah, I think that. Okay.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our session is terminated, but I would like to invite you to a second round in the next edition, 2024, Biennale Tecnologia, joining us in Torino. Hopefully, you can be able to come, and so we wait for you next time. Thank you very
That will
much,
be great. Thank
Professor
you. Yeah.
Sun, Professor Alekna, Professor Bardi. Very warm thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.
See you soon. Grazie a tutti. Un invito domani alle 11:30, cioè alle 10:30, scusate, 10:30 in aula 7 c'è una sorta di continuazione. Oggi abbiamo guardato la storia della scienza, domani un incontro che si chiama La Cina domani, tecnologia e società, con Lucia Pasqualini che è appena tornata da Canton dove è stata console generale d'Italia. Vi aspettiamo. Grazie. Grazie.